Japan just fired an anti-ship missile near China. But this is not just Japan's message. Behind that missile were U.S. troops, U.S. weapons, U.S. alliances, and a strategy that could decide whether America goes to war with China. Because this was not just a drill. It was a preview of how America and its allies may try to stop China's Navy in a future crisis. And that raises a much bigger question. Is America preventing a war with China, or quietly preparing the battlefield for one? Let's start with a number that rarely appears in the headlines about this event. 10,000. Approximately 10,000 American service members participated in the military exercise called Balikatan 2026. That exercise ran from April 20th to May 8th, 2026. More than 17,000 troops in total, drawn from 7 actively participating nations: the Philippines, the United States, Australia, Japan, Canada, France, and New Zealand. An additional 17 nations sent observers. This is not a small event that happens to involve some Americans. This is a major American military operation that happens to be held on Philippine soil. Balikatan is an annual exercise. It has been running for decades, but the 2026 edition was described by U.S. Indo-Pacific Command as the most expansive Balikatan exercise to date. That is not a detail. That is a signal. Military exercises do not become the most expansive in their history by accident. They expand when the strategic requirement expands, when the threat assessment grows, when the alliance architecture being rehearsed needs to be tested at a larger scale. And the alliance architecture being rehearsed in Balikatan 2026 is specifically designed for one geographic scenario: a crisis near Taiwan and the South China Sea. Now, why should an American viewer care about this? Not out of abstract geopolitical interest, out of direct material interest. American taxpayers fund the forces deployed there. American treaty commitments to the Philippines and Japan create legal obligations that could, under certain scenarios, require American military action. American supply chains, the chips in your phone, the components in your car, the electronics in your home, depend on the stability of the region being militarized in these drills. This is not distant. American troops were there. American weapons were there. When Japan fired that missile, it fired it alongside an American strategic posture that has been building for years. And the consequences of that posture, whether it succeeds in deterring conflict or whether it accelerates the friction it is designed to prevent, will not stay on a military map in the Pacific. They will travel through supply chains, through oil prices, through shipping routes, through the cost of electronics, through the stability of financial markets. So before we ask why Japan fired the missile, we need to ask something more important. Why was America standing behind it? The facts cleanly stated. On May 6, 2026, Japan's self-defense forces fired a Type 88 anti-ship missile during Balikatan 2026. The location was the northern Philippines, specifically a maritime area facing the South China Sea. The target was a decommissioned Philippine Navy vessel. The missile hit its target. Witnesses to the launch included Philippine Defense Secretary Gilberto Teodoro and Japan's Defense Minister Shinjiro Koizumi. These were not low-level observers. The presence of defense ministers at a live-fire demonstration is a deliberate political act. It signals that this launch is endorsed at the highest levels of government. It signals that the capability being demonstrated carries official weight. Japan's self-defense forces, anti-ship missile, South China Sea direction. Each element is significant individually. Together, they form a picture. Japan has spent most of the post-war period operating under significant constitutional constraints on its military posture. The self-defense forces are exactly what the name suggests: defensive in doctrine, limited in projection. But the past decade has seen a sustained and deliberate expansion of Japan's military capabilities and its willingness to exercise them publicly. Japan is not the passive rear area ally it was during the Cold War. It is becoming an active participant in the forward deterrence network that the United States is assembling around China's maritime perimeter. Japan, Canada, France, and New Zealand participated actively in Balikatan 2026 for the first time. First time. That is not a footnote. That is a coalition expanding in scope and visibility at a moment of deliberately elevated tension. On paper, this was a military exercise, a drill, a training event. On the map, it looked like a rehearsal. The target was a decommissioned vessel. But the targeting logic, anti-ship missiles, South China Sea orientation, allied coordination across multiple nations, pointed somewhere beyond the exercise. A rehearsal does not tell you when the performance will happen. It tells you that the performers are preparing, that the staging is being worked out, that the timing and coordination are being practiced, that if an event were to occur, the system would be ready to respond. That is what Balikatan 2026 communicated. Not a threat, not an act of war, a demonstration of readiness. And demonstrations of readiness at sufficient scale and in sufficient proximity to contested geography carry their own message. The target was not China, but the message was impossible to miss. So what exactly was the message? And what does the map look like when you zoom out far enough to understand it? Pull up a map. Find Taiwan. The island sits off the southeastern coast of China, roughly 100 miles across the Taiwan Strait from the mainland. Now, look south. Below Taiwan, separating it from the Philippine archipelago, lies the Luzon Strait, a body of water approximately 250 miles wide, connecting the South China Sea to the Pacific Ocean. That strait is not just geography. In any future crisis involving Taiwan or the South China Sea, it is one of the most critical passages on Earth, for naval movement in either direction, for supply lines, for the projection of force, or the denial of it. Now find the Batanes Islands, the northernmost islands of the Philippines, sitting at the southern entrance of the Luzon Strait, approximately 100 miles, 155 kilometers from Taiwan. During the same Balikatan 2026 exercise, in which Japan fired its Type 88 missile, United States and Philippine forces deploy NMESIS, the Navy Marine Expeditionary Ship Interdiction System, in Batanes. NMESIS is a land-based anti-ship missile system. It was flown into Bosco, the main island of Batanes, for simulated exercises. According to Reuters, NMESIS can target ships at distances of up to 185 kilometers. 185 kilometers of range, from a position approximately 100 miles from Taiwan, at the entrance to the Luzon Strait. Sit with that geography for a moment. These islands are not just islands. In a crisis, they become launch points, radar points, supply points, pressure points. A missile on a ship can be moved, repositioned, withdrawn. A missile on an island becomes part of the island's strategic weight. The island does not move. And land-based missile systems distributed across multiple islands can create overlapping fields of coverage that complicate and potentially deny naval movement through the waters they cover. This is what military planners call sea denial, not controlling the sea, but making it too dangerous for an adversary's navy to use freely. The South China Sea, toward which Japan's Type 88 missile was oriented, carries approximately 1/3 of global shipping, according to estimates by the Center for Strategic and International Studies. In 2023, according to the U.S. Energy Information Administration, 10 billion barrels of petroleum and petroleum products pass through the South China Sea, along with approximately 6.7 trillion cubic feet of liquefied natural gas. 1/3 of global shipping, 10 billion barrels of oil, 6.7 trillion cubic feet of gas. This is not a body of water. This is the circulatory system of the global economy. And the military exercises taking place along its edge are not incidental to that economic reality. They are directly connected to it, because whoever can credibly threaten to deny access to the South China Sea holds significant leverage over the economies of Asia, Europe, and the Americas that depend on what flows through it. That is what makes the map so important. That is what makes the geography of Batanes, a collection of small islands most people have never heard of, suddenly matter in a way that has nothing to do with the islands themselves. And that is exactly why Beijing is watching this very differently than Washington. Perspective is not a luxury in geopolitics. It is a strategic variable. The same set of facts can be read in diametrically opposite ways, depending on where you sit. And understanding how Beijing reads the map that Washington is constructing does not require sympathy for the Chinese government. It requires the kind of analytical discipline that asks, if you were in their position, looking at the same data, what would you conclude? Here is what Beijing sees. On its eastern maritime perimeter, the United States Navy, operating from bases in Japan, Guam, and increasingly the Philippines. On its southern maritime perimeter, the Philippines, increasingly integrated into U.S. military planning and hosting American weapon systems on islands 100 miles from Taiwan. Farther south, Australia, which has signed security arrangements deepening defense ties with the United States. And now, active coordination between Japan, the Philippines, Australia, and the United States, demonstrated in real time with real weapons in real geography. Washington calls this deterrence. Beijing calls it encirclement. And here is the strategic trap that both sides are navigating or failing to navigate. Deterrence theory holds that if you make the cost of aggression sufficiently high, the potential aggressor will choose not to act. The logic is coherent, but it depends on shared understanding of what constitutes a defensive posture and what constitutes a threatening one. When the defensive posture looks, from the other side, like preparation for an offensive, deterrence can produce the opposite of its intended effect. Instead of reducing the probability of conflict, it can accelerate it, not because either side wants war, but because each side's defensive preparations read as offensive preparations to the other side. China faces a particularly uncomfortable version of this dilemma. If China does nothing in response to the growing Allied network, no patrols, no counter-exercises, no diplomatic protests, it accepts a visible asymmetry. It allows the perception of being contained. For a government whose legitimacy rests substantially on projecting strength and sovereignty, that is not a sustainable position. But if China responds aggressively, if it escalates its military activities in the South China Sea, increases pressure on Taiwan, or directly confronts Philippine or Japanese assets, it validates precisely the threat assessment that drove its neighbors toward the United States in the first place. It hands Washington the justification for exactly the coalition it has been trying to build. This is the trap. The more China pressures its neighbors, the more those neighbors seek American protection. The more those neighbors seek American protection, the more coordinated the alliance becomes. The more coordinated the alliance becomes, the more China feels surrounded. The more China feels surrounded, the more it is tempted to act before the encirclement is complete. Washington calls this deterrence. Beijing calls it encirclement. Both descriptions are simultaneously accurate. And that is where a missile test becomes something much larger. The first visible architecture of a missile wall. The phrase missile wall is a metaphor. Use it carefully. It does not describe a literal barrier. It describes a strategic concept, a distributed network of land-based anti-ship missile systems, allied military forces, radar installations, and coordinated command structures, positioned across a chain of islands and allied territories along China's maritime exits. The logic of the missile wall is different from the logic of the aircraft carrier. An aircraft carrier projects power. It is mobile, visible, and capable of delivering force across vast distances. But it is also a large, expensive, identifiable target. In a conflict with a sophisticated adversary, an aircraft carrier is a liability as much as an asset. In Batanes, NMESIS was positioned with a range of up to 185 kilometers, according to Reuters, at a distance of approximately 100 miles from Taiwan. In northern Philippines, Japan demonstrated its Type 88 anti-ship capability alongside American and Australian forces facing the South China Sea. The Philippines provides the geography. Japan adds missile capability and a powerful signal about its own willingness to engage. The United States provides the systems, the logistics, the command architecture, and the alliance credibility that makes the network function as a whole. Australia and the other participating nations add coalition depth and legitimacy. 7 active participating nations, 17 observer nations. This is not an improvised response to a crisis. This is an architecture under construction, deliberate, systematic, expanding. The shift is significant. In earlier decades, American deterrence in the Pacific rested primarily on large, visible platforms, carrier strike groups, air bases, and the implied threat of American nuclear capability. But the additions to the architecture, land-based anti-ship missiles on small islands, distributed coastal defense systems, multi-nation interoperability exercises, represent a different theory of deterrence. Less about showing power, more about denying access. Aircraft carriers show power. Missile islands deny access. And access denial, the ability to make the waters near Taiwan and the South China Sea too dangerous for Chinese naval forces to operate freely, is what the network being assembled during Balikatan 2026 is designed to provide. The question is whether this network deters the scenario it is designed to prevent, or whether it is building the very battlefield it says it wants to avoid. But before we go there, we need to understand what this geography actually protects. Because this is not only a military map, it is an economic map. And what it shows about Taiwan and the South China Sea may be the most important argument of all. There is a number that should appear in any serious discussion of Taiwan's strategic importance: 90%. Taiwan accounts for more than 90% of leading-edge chip manufacturing globally, according to the U.S. International Trade Administration. The most advanced semiconductors, the chips that go into the most sophisticated computers, the most advanced AI systems, the most capable military equipment, the smartphones in your pocket, come overwhelmingly from one island. One island in one strait, in one region, where 17,000 troops just held the most expansive Allied military exercise in recent memory. Add to that, Taiwan accounts for more than 60% of global semiconductor foundry revenue. These numbers are not about Taiwan's economy. They are about the global economy's dependency on a single geographic point. Now add the South China Sea. The Center for Strategic and International Studies estimates that the South China Sea carries approximately 1/3 of global shipping. In 2023, the U.S. Energy Information Administration reported that 10 billion barrels of petroleum and petroleum products transited those waters, along with 6.7 trillion cubic feet of liquefied natural gas, 1/3 of global shipping. The oil that powers industries across Asia and beyond, the gas that heats homes and runs power plants, the chips that power every digital device, all of it concentrated in one region. If the Strait of Hormuz is the oil choke point, the geographic pressure point where energy flows can be interrupted, then Taiwan and the South China Sea together are the technology choke point. The place where the disruption of supply chains would reverberate not just through energy markets, but through every sector of the modern economy that depends on advanced electronics. Bloomberg Economics estimated that a conflict around Taiwan could cost the global economy approximately $10 trillion. That estimate represents roughly 10% of global gross domestic product. $10 trillion, 10% of global GDP. This is not a geopolitical abstraction. This is what the military map over which Japan fired its missile is protecting, or depending on how the deterrence calculation plays out, risking. Think about what a disruption to Taiwan's semiconductor output would mean in practical terms. Cars that cannot be built because they lack chips, consumer electronics that cannot be manufactured, industrial equipment that cannot be completed, AI development that stalls because the hardware is unavailable, medical devices, defense systems, banking infrastructure, communications networks. The modern economy does not run on oil alone. It runs on semiconductors. And the world's semiconductor supply chain is extraordinarily concentrated in a region that is now visibly and deliberately being militarized. A missile drill near Taiwan is also a story about chip supply. A military exercise in the northern Philippines is also a story about the shipping lanes through which 1/3 of global trade moves. A land-based missile system on a Philippine island is also a story about the energy flows that run beneath the waters it is designed to deny. Military geography and economic geography are the same geography. That is the connection that does not appear in the press releases, but it is the connection that makes this relevant to every person whose daily life depends on the functioning of global supply chains, which is to say, virtually everyone watching this. A crisis in the South China Sea does not stay on a military map. It shows up in the price of a car, the delivery time for electronics, the cost of energy, the stability of markets, the interest rate on a loan. The geography is distant. The consequences are not. Let's return to the first image. A missile launched from the northern Philippines. A decommissioned vessel targeted and struck. 17,000 troops assembled across 7 nations. Defense ministers watching. Observer nations taking notes. The official description, a military exercise. The strategic reality, the most expansive iteration of a decades-old Allied exercise, expanded to include new active participants. Japan, Canada, France, New Zealand, in a geographic area directly adjacent to the most consequential potential flashpoint in the current world order. This is not, in the technical sense, a countdown. No one is claiming that war is inevitable. No serious analyst has concluded that a military conflict in the South China Sea or around Taiwan is imminent. But there is a difference between inevitable and accelerating, and what Balikatan 2026 represents, what the deployment of NMESIS in Batanes represents, what Japan's Type 88 launch represents, what 17 observer nations watching the exercise represents, is a region that has moved from the phase of diplomatic tension to the phase of realistic military rehearsal. Real missiles, real geography, real coordination. America is trying to prevent war by preparing for war. This is not a contradiction. This is the logic of deterrence, and it has a long and largely successful track record. The Cold War did not become hot, in large part, because both sides knew that the other side was genuinely prepared to fight. But deterrence carries a specific risk that is poorly understood in public discourse. Deterrence works when the potential adversary understands the defensive intent of the force being assembled, when the adversary looks at the network of missiles, allies, and exercises and concludes, the cost of aggression is too high, we will not attempt it. Deterrence fails, not through the aggressor choosing war, but through miscalculation, when the adversary looks at the same network and concludes, this is not defensive, this is preparation for a strike, this is encirclement reaching completion, this is the moment we must act, before the noose tightens further. The missile wall looks like deterrence from Washington. It looks different from Beijing. China's combat readiness patrols near Scarborough Shoal during Balikatan 2026 were not a coincidence. They were a countersignal, a demonstration that China is watching, that China is not accepting a passive posture, that China is willing to show military presence in contested waters while U.S. allies rehearse missile strikes nearby. This is how escalatory cycles begin, not with a decision to go to war, with a cycle of signals and countersignals, each of which is internally justifiable as defensive, and each of which reads to the other side as evidence of growing threat. The United States and its allies have made a strategic judgment that the deterrence benefits of this architecture outweigh the escalation risks. They may be right. The argument is serious. It is based on real historical precedent, and it reflects a genuine assessment of Chinese intentions and capabilities. But the argument on the other side is also serious. Every new participant added to Balikatan, every new weapon system deployed to Batanes, every Type 88 missile fired facing the South China Sea. These are data points in Beijing's threat assessment. And Beijing's response to an evolving threat assessment is not to de-escalate. It is to counter-prepare. What can be said with confidence is this: the region has changed. What was once a pattern of diplomatic friction and occasional naval standoffs has become something more structured, more rehearsed, more militarized. Japan is no longer a passive ally. It is an active participant in forward deterrence operations. The Philippines is no longer simply a former treaty partner. It is hosting American missile systems on islands 100 miles from Taiwan. Australia, Canada, France, and New Zealand are not distant observers. They are active participants in an exercise explicitly designed to rehearse sea denial operations in contested waters. 17,000 troops, 7 nations participating, 17 nations watching. And China, on the other side of the map, conducting combat readiness patrols and watching the architecture take shape. This is not a crisis, but it is something more than a status quo. It is the shape of what might become a crisis, being practiced and refined, year by year, exercise by exercise, missile by missile. America is turning geography into a weapon around China. The islands are the platform. The missiles are the argument. The allies are the coalition. And the question, the one that does not have an answer yet, the one that the governments involved are betting on getting right, is whether the architecture deters the conflict it is designed to prevent, or whether it accelerates the calculation it is trying to forestall. That is not a rhetorical question. It is the most important strategic question in the world right now. Because if the deterrence works, the world's chip supply stays intact. The South China Sea keeps moving 1/3 of global trade. The price of electronics does not spike. The global economy does not absorb a $10 trillion shock. And if the deterrence fails or is misread, the consequences will not stay on a military map. They will arrive at your door, in prices, in shortages, in the cost of things you buy, and in the decisions of governments that will be made under conditions none of us can fully predict. A missile was fired in the northern Philippines on May 6, 2026. The target was decommissioned. The exercise was planned. The participants were allies. The cameras were rolling. And the message, for anyone looking at the map carefully enough, was unmistakable. Leave your answer below. Because this decision, the one being made in Washington, in Tokyo, in Manila, in Beijing, will matter to more people than the governments making it. It will matter to all of us.